a city at the brink.
我覺得政治冇可能係永遠嘅和平。
A society divided.
How can you beat the communists by using violence?
Nobody is above the law.
A police force stretched to the limit.
Well, I think we're very much caught in the middle of this one.
A government overwhelmed.
The government's ability to control the narrative was next to zero.
This is Hong Kong 2019. A sea of dissent and an outpouring of grievances. Peaceful and powerful. Organisers estimated that 1 million people took to the streets for this massive protest.
即係而家唔行出嚟嘅話，其實之後可能亦都冇咩更多嘅機會，更加好嘅機會去彰顯我哋群眾嘅力量。
呢啲反對呢啲惡法咯，逼我哋啲香港人啊，我哋要企出嚟反對。反對送中惡法！反對送中惡法！反對送。
Jimmy Sham, a seasoned protest organiser, was at the forefront of this first mass rally.
恐懼，我每一次搞遊行都充滿住擔心。人數少，係擔心緊呢條路點樣走落去；人數多，係點樣可以令到個遊行可以井然有序。
The catalyst for Hong Kong's worst political crisis and social unrest since its return to Chinese sovereignty in 1997 was Chief Executive Carrie Lam's move to allow the transfer of fugitives to Taiwan. She had wanted to help the family of a pregnant Hong Kong girl murdered in Taiwan in 2018 by her boyfriend, Chan Tong Kai, who fled back home to Hong Kong to avoid prosecution. But expanding the law to include extradition to mainland China sparked a huge public backlash. Opponents feared the new law could be used as a tool for the political persecution of Beijing's critics.
If that extradition bill had gone through, then I may be already sitting today in a jail in China, because they could just officially get us back on some trumped-up charges.
Veteran opposition figure Martin Lee, one of the founding fathers of the city's pro-democracy movement, was among the many who refused to buy the government's assurances that the extradition law would have built-in protections against such abuse and local courts would have the final say on any transfer of fugitives.
They saw the danger. Once I suppose the people knew that this is so dangerous, anybody could be just brought back to China for trial, and that would apply to any visitor to Hong Kong. That's how the extensive damage it will cause to people's freedoms.
We all knew it was politically sensitive and potentially controversial, but the chief executive was determined to go ahead with it to resolve the Chan Tong Kai case, and we had no good reason not to support her.
Regina Ip is a long-time lawmaker, former security chief, and now a key government advisor. She says she was satisfied there would be enough checks and balances to prevent abuse. But Ip and other pro-establishment figures ended up stunned by the intensity of the backlash.
Maybe in the course of handling it, the government underestimated the complexity and the degree of opposition. But it's hard to, get this sort of legal messages, get people to grasp these legal messages. So the opposition has greatly improved their skills in stirring up fear and anger, and hatred and distrust of mainland China, anger at our own government.
6月9號嗰一晚，最令到我憤怒，我諗我係同樣憤怒嘅人， 我冇記錯，佢係10點幾11點嘅時候咧，政府新聞處係發咗個新聞稿出嚟，佢係話即係政府會如期移動。我嗰下都係非常之憤怒，即係究竟要幾多人出嚟，佢先至肯停。
Frustrations exploded that night. Days later, it was time for a showdown. Lawmakers were scheduled to hear the second reading of the extradition bill at the Legislative Council. But protesters arrived early. They built barricades to prevent pro-establishment lawmakers from entering the building.
去令到建制派可以睇得到香港人嘅意志係點，佢哋要找數。
The police shouldn't have allowed the demonstrators to block us from entering.
Very early in the morning that day, there was some police vehicles and a government vehicle, one of the ministers, surrounded under that underpass, and they were trapped. And they weren't released for the whole day.
Rupert Dover was on the scene as a top police field commander, monitoring the standoff firsthand for hours. The government ended up delaying the second reading of the extradition bill, but protesters refused to leave, demanding its complete withdrawal.
We knew they'd been digging up bricks, they'd been in the nearby construction site, they had iron rods, they had all sorts of weapons.
It wasn't that violent. I mean, you can see some things being thrown at the police and so on, but by and large, it's just... I don't like to see violence, all right? But you see people were just rushing, trying to rush at the police cordon all set up, and then doing that sort of thing. And they were not really attacking the police much. I mean, they were using umbrellas, defending themselves from the pepper spray and other things. Some of them were throwing some bricks, but very few. So I would call that certainly force was used, and whatever violence, it was not vicious. And they were on the receiving end, most of them.
This was the first time tear gas had been fired in Hong Kong since the pro-democracy Occupy protests of 2014.
The other alternative would have been for me to march those police officers down that road into a massive crowd with a lot of persons overhead who we knew were armed with bricks and all sorts of objects. And there could have been huge casualties to the police.
林鄭佢決定同103萬嘅市民對着幹，佢唯一嘅武器就係警察。佢就係預咗用警察嚟將香港人打到唔再出聲。
Despite the police action, the protesters blocking LegCo did have a victory that day. The extradition law had been stopped in its tracks.
They did the trick. It stopped the pro-Beijing members of the legislature from going into the building to pass the bill into law. Now, but for that sort of force, that bill would have been passed. There's no doubt about it.
3 days later, on the eve of another mass protest, Carrie Lam announced the suspension of the bill to try and calm the situation.
I now announce that the government has decided to suspend the legislative amendment exercise.
It was too late. The next day saw an even larger turnout. A record 2 million people, according to organizers, although the figure has been disputed by others. The full withdrawal of the extradition bill was not the only demand now. They were calling for police to retract the term riot in describing the June 12th clashes and drop charges against those arrested that day. The death of a man who fell from scaffolding along the protest route the day before swelled the ranks of the demonstrators and prompted them to wear all black, a uniform they would keep for the months ahead. The government followed up with a written apology to the people of Hong Kong that night, but no mention of the protesters' demands.
The government's ability to control the narrative was next to zero.
Solo was one of the hardcore protesters at the front lines of clashes with police, branded as rioters and criminals by the authorities. He spoke to us on the condition of complete anonymity, fearing arrest and prosecution.
但係警方不斷將所有嘢推向極端，從而令到好多人都想做啲好極端嘅行為去反抗，去爭取返自己追求嘅公義。香港人加油！香港人加油！香港人加油！香港人
July 1st, the anniversary of Hong Kong's return from British to Chinese rule, has been marked every year since the 1997 handover with a protest march. But in 2019, the anniversary would be marked by something unthinkable. The siege and sacking of the Legislative Council, initiated by splinter groups of protesters who broke away from a larger, peaceful march.
7·1就係喺和理非嘅人開始之前已經用武器嚟，嗰一刻我係有啲措手不及。
The crowds outside the building built up into thousands, locked in a standoff with police for hours. Shortly after 9 p.m, the glass walls and doors were breached.
If you sack electrical, that's really equivalent to subverting government. That's very serious. It's not just simple criminal damage.
I said that is too ugly. Too ugly.
我唔認為係衝擊，我係認為係一個光復立法會嘅活動。因為立法會喺過往嘅20幾年未曾真正發揮佢需要發揮嘅作用，亦都有好多不平等、不公平、不公義嘅事件多次發生喺立法會裏邊。
Riot police inside the building retreated before the first protesters rushed in. Why they left is a matter that still bothers all sides.
The police the performance at that time during the first phase was disappointing.
If the police had not abandoned that building at such a crucial stage, none of them could have happened. None of them. That's the reality of the situation.
I had by that stage about 600, 700 officers ready to go, ready to disperse the crowd. We were never told to do it. Why the decision was made not to do that, I don't know. There were other officers deployed inside LegCo, and obviously they have a far better idea about what's happening than I do. But it was frustrating. We had a big team there ready to go and sort this problem out, but we were not deployed. I don't think in any other jurisdiction, any other country, you would allow the seat of government to be invaded, vandalised, literally destroyed. And we did.
The trashing of the legislature was a hugely symbolic escalation. For the government, an unacceptable assault on elected authority. For the protesters, a rejection of failed political promises. No rioters, only tyranny, the slogan they left behind.
我覺得政治冇可能係永遠嘅和平去爭取得到翻嚟嘅，特別當你面對緊一個極權政府下嘅一個傀儡政府。
Deputy Police Commissioner Raymond Siu directed operations from headquarters during the first months of turmoil.
You cannot just glorify this sort of violence, say by saying that achieving justice by violating the law is okay. No, it shouldn't be. This is ridiculous. People making this sort of statement is irresponsible.
A foreign diplomat actually said to me he was very surprised that even after such a traumatic event, the government didn't hit back harder. That sort of action would have amounted to trying to overthrow government.
After the sacking of the Legislative Council, a critical turning point came during a mass rally on Hong Kong Island. Some protesters splintered off and made their way to Beijing's liaison office in the city. They vandalized the building facade and defaced the national symbol. The unprecedented insult and challenge to Beijing's authority was a message to China's leaders that this was no longer just a problem confined to Hong Kong and its internal affairs. It laid the groundwork for direct intervention later from the central government that would change everything. What was initially resentment against the police force turned into intense hatred of the men and women in blue. And it all came to a head that same night after the liaison office was vandalized. Footage broadcast on television and shared on social media showed a mob of men in white attacking people with metal rods at the MTR station in Yuen Long in the New Territories. They were there to target returning protesters, but their rampage was as indiscriminate as it was brutal. It took police 39 minutes to respond to distress calls.
There were lots and lots of incidents going on that evening. There was another major public event down in Hong Kong Island, so our resources are tight.
So when this incident did suddenly pop up in Yuen Long, there's an automatic time lag, time delay to get the requisite sort of manpower up there. Was the main bulk of the riot police arrival slow? Yeah, it was, because of the distances concerned.
Protesters and their supporters accused police of being deliberately slow to respond. They saw it as proof of collusion between officers and criminal elements among the white-clad mob.
Then I knew the communists and the police and these triad people are working together. Can there be any doubt?
佢哋只去捉捕示威者、抗爭者同路人受喐，但係冇捉捕啲鄉黑去歸案嘅即時嗰晚。咁呢一個係十分之羞恥嘅事嚟嘅。如果我係警隊嘅一份子嘅話，亦都覺得十分之羞恥。
On August the 5th, Hong Kongers woke up to a city almost completely paralyzed. Protesters called for a citywide strike to escalate their campaign and spread out across Hong Kong to enforce it. Public transport ground to a halt as protesters blocked road traffic. They disrupted train services by stopping carriage doors from closing. Hundreds of flights were cancelled at Hong Kong's international airport as air traffic controllers called in sick at the last minute. At least 10 districts across the city were rocked by violence. And there was much more to come. Petrol bombs became a weapon of choice for the radicals. Police increased their use of rubber bullets and pepper spray and fired thousands of rounds of tear gas at the increasingly angry crowds. The protest movement ramped up efforts to make more global headlines by taking over the arrival hall of Hong Kong's international airport. It was all peaceful at first, but eventually for the first time, clashes at the airport with horrified international travelers looking on. Their journeys disrupted, hundreds of flights cancelled. And ugly scenes like this. The airport drama reached its climax on a night when protesters held a mainland Chinese man hostage, beating him and accusing him of being an undercover policeman.
China sent people pretending as press to be undercover.
He turned out to be a reporter for a Beijing-based newspaper who was rescued by paramedics. Further chaos erupted as police forced their way into the departure hall to make way for the medics. When it was all over, the protesters realized they'd gone too far and tried to make up for it in the morning. After a court injunction banning them from the main terminal building, the protesters left the airport and did not return. The street violence expanded into train stations, disrupting the city's most popular and convenient mode of public transport. A police crackdown at Prince Edward MTR station became a defining moment, with officers storming onto a train to go after protesters.
呢一個係亦都係另外一個去顯現警方暴力、無理、失敗嘅行為嘅一個最大轉捩點之一嚟嘅。
In terms of the Prince Edward side of things, we'd had this situation where the MTR became virtually a no-go zone for police. Police didn't go into the MTR system. Protesters could move around wherever they wanted. Logistically, that created all sorts of problems because crowds could move very quickly from one area to another simply by using the MTR. When the police eventually went into the MTR system, I think it had quite a positive impact on how we controlled the riots and our ability to respond to the riots, because suddenly with the protesters they realised this wasn't just their sort of automatic escape route.
Anger turned against the MTR, which was accused of colluding with police against protesters using the railway network. It became routine for radicals to set MTR entrances on fire, destroy ticket machines and turnstiles, and cause as much damage as possible. Train stations became tear gas-filled battlegrounds, and violence intensified all round.
No law enforcement agents in the world would tolerate this sort of level of violence against the police officers. Violence used by the rioters invites forceful response, and that applies to all police officers, all police agents in the world. There are lots of people criticizing us using excessive force, but have you heard these people criticizing, condemning violence used by the rioters? Of course, I feel this is unfair to us. Our use of force guidelines, they basically is benchmark the international standard.
呢個正正就係話俾我聽，點解啲後生仔最後會選擇私了，就係因為佢未必好識點樣講嗰兩句出嚟，但係佢睇到啊嘛。拉人嘅就係警察，藍絲你就放，黃絲你就打，咁你同我講乜嘢發展啊？
我相信721同831呢兩件事件係將好多中立派系嘅人士推向所謂我哋嘅黃絲派系，亦都將好多淺藍推返去中立。
藍絲就覺得遊行嘅人搞亂香港，令到佢哋生活唔到，於是乎就斬佢。然之後黃絲就覺得藍絲呢一班人係即係港豬，然之後又傷害佢哋，個社會徹底地去分裂。
For all sides, it was now a fight for Hong Kong's soul. October 1st, China's National Day. And across Hong Kong in 2019, it is a day of chaos. In stark contrast, President Xi Jinping leads celebrations in Beijing for the rest of the country. Public opinion across mainland China is strongly against the violence in Hong Kong, and on this day, the amplified unrest becomes a national embarrassment. 13 of Hong Kong's 18 districts are rocked by clashes between radical anti-government protesters and police. The MTR system is shut down. Shops and businesses shuttered. Smoke from burning barricades and tear gas fumes fill the air. Given the intensity of the clashes, it is something that is bound to happen sooner or later, and it does. An 18-year-old protester is shot in the chest at close range by a police officer under attack. It marks the first time during months of protests that anyone is shot by a live round.
The action of the police were actually kept on TV camera, so everybody can see that.
I was deployed in Taiwan, where the shooting took place of the young boy. Extremely violent crowd that day, out to have conflict, to cause trouble. I would say from the various deployments I had for that 7-month period, that October 1st one was by far and away the most violent.
Police fire 6 live rounds that day, and while no one is killed, the escalation causes widespread alarm.
If it is a life-threatening situation, we have well-established guidelines when we need to use firearms. I wouldn't say that our frontline officers are doing everything perfect on the ground, but I hope that everybody need to bear in mind that our frontline officers on the ground, they are facing a lot of stress and challenges.
The teenager who was shot undergoes emergency surgery and survives. He is also arrested and charged with rioting and assaulting a police officer. The first use of deadly force by police and resentment against them over the Yunlong controversy lead to a sharp escalation of violence. But it's not all police versus protesters. Supporters and opponents of the protest movement are pitted against each other. A deeply divided society is reflected in 2 opposing colors. Yellow for the anti-government movement, blue for those who support police and the establishment. Vigilante violence becomes commonplace as radical protesters take to assaulting people who speak out against them on the streets. Extreme opponents of the protest movement also engage in tit-for-tat violence. Society is in full upheaval.
其實如果你有回顧6月、7月、8月，其實係大概8月中先至開始出現我哋嗰邊私了其他派系政治派系人士嘅事件嘅。咁好多時候，我認為係因為藍色嗰邊嘅派系，即係對家嘅派系咧，當然包括埋黑社會同警察啦。咁佢哋會做好多不必要嘅暴力事件出嚟，去催化我哋嗰邊嘅憤怒同埋個武力程度啦。甚至乎，如果你喺街上面你一表態你係邊嗰個顏色派系嘅人，你亦都會即刻受到襲擊啊，甚至乎係無理嘅傷害啦。咁呢一種情況下，市民嘅團結性同團結度都咁低嘅時候咧，我認為政府施政會失敗咯。
This particular attack on a Mandarin-speaking JP Morgan Chase employee by protesters outside the company's headquarters has a deep impact on public opinion. Many are repulsed by the lawlessness. protest violence spins out of control, targeting businesses with links to mainland China and those seen as sympathetic towards the blue camp. The demonstrations continue long after Chief Executive Carrie Lam has formally withdrawn the extradition bill, a gesture which does little to ease anger on the streets. For many, it is too little, too late. The protesters have a list of 5 demands, now including an independent investigation into police conduct and amnesty for the many arrested. Lam's government rejects the demands as unreasonable, but has no other political solution to offer. Hong Kong is torn apart.
警方同政府嘅犧牲咧，佢哋嘅生死咧，其實我哋就唔太理會嘅，因為大家都係敵人啦，冇理由我要你敵人嘅感受同埋身體情況去判斷我應唔應該去進行武力升級㗎嘛。
I took my oath of office in 1988 to the Hong Kong government and the people of Hong Kong, and that's what I do, that's what we, the police force, do. We serve the people of Hong Kong. They might not necessarily agree with everything we've been doing of late, but I honestly, hand on heart, believe what we have done has saved Hong Kong from a far worse fate. The Hong Kong police has been put in the middle of what is a political conundrum, a political problem, dilemma. We're in the middle of it. We're not trying to solve the political problem. We're just trying to keep Hong Kong safe so that people can go about their normal daily lives.
Tear gas is used for dispersing the crowd, and tear gas has been used by a lot of countries for 100 years, but nobody criticized that. We just want to disperse the crowd. When we use the Special Crowd Management Vehicle, SCMP, when we use the color dye, we also receive criticism. What do you expect us to do? Verbal advice, verbal warning? Then people would criticize us being impolite. Is that fair? While criticizing us using different level of force, then are they criticizing the other party? The rioters using that sort of violence. Those are the lethal weapons. Petrol bombs, firearms, explosives.
其實我一路以嚟都對汽油彈係有好大嘅恐懼同埋擔憂，即係好驚會傷到人。但係你見到喺成個示威嘅過程裏邊咧，即係絕大部分嘅示威者其實佢嗰個汽油彈都係掟喺地下，掟落個地下嗰度，即係阻止警方推進，或者佢哋走嘅時候為自己開一條路。喺一個運動裏面一個經歷嘅時候，我慢慢理解到其實嗰個汽油彈佢哋嘅作用其實係保護自己。反之，警察話咗開槍係唔可以接受嘅，會繼續嘅。
Constant clashes and tear gas-filled streets take their toll on residents of built-up neighborhoods such as Macau. Bonnie Ho is one of them.
咁我呢度樓下就已經係亞皆老街啦，我又望住彌敦道啦 ，OK。咁其實晚晚就喺呢個十字路口位，晚晚都會見到警察喺度布防咯。跟住然之後咁啲示威者就喺樓下揾啲雜物啊、垃圾桶啊嗰啲好多嘢喺度擋住條路。 因為佢有時放催淚彈咧會放到我樓下嘅，放完啦，我即刻閂窗啊，即刻走去洗面啊，擋住煙啊，跟住又開風扇吹下先啦，唔係成間屋都係嗰陣味啊嘛。跟住然之後，我仔都唔夠1個鐘頭就流鼻血啦。跟住之後又咳啦，跟住咳咗成個禮拜。
The social unrest takes a turn for the worse in November, plumbing new depths of violence. The death of Chow Si-lok, a university student who fell from a multi-story car park while police were conducting a clearance operation nearby, sparks a renewed backlash. Young protesters call for more aggressive action. University campuses become the new war zones. Regular and radical student protesters, joined by extremists, take over 5 university campuses on November 11th, calling for a citywide general strike. The violence spills over into a second day.
Hong Kong's rule of law has been pushed to the brink of total collapse as mass rioters recklessly escalate their violence under the false hope that they can get away with it.
Police enter the Chinese University of Hong Kong campus, accusing radicals of criminal damage and stockpiling an arsenal of weapons to fight them. An attempt to mediate by the university's vice-chancellor failed. Protesters and police fight for control of a key bridge leading to the campus. The Battle of the Bridge lasts for hours.
They were the hardcore front line, Yong Mo Pai, you know, the militants, you know, with the best training, who tried to take possession of the university campuses. And what they were doing was really dangerous, so they had to be stopped.
要死都要保住中大，甚至乎犧牲都要保住中大嘅原因，就係因為中大嘅建校基礎就係反共㗎嘛。咁而共產黨嘅傀儡嘅政權所派出嘅警力係需要進攻呢一個我哋所謂進攻呢一個中大嘅時候，咁我哋梗係武力梗係立即提高，同埋亦都係會作出最大嘅抵抗啦。
Students at other universities respond with extreme measures, fortifying their campuses, barricading entrances, and blocking public access to road and rail traffic. But police keep their distance. By the end of the week, all but one of the campuses are abandoned. Outside the Baptist University campus, where protesters block the road with debris, a striking scene unfolds. People's Liberation Army soldiers emerge from their nearby barracks to clean up the mess. They turn out in gym shorts and vests, armed with buckets and brooms rather than guns. This is the first and only intervention in the protests by the PLA, and it's all over in an hour. All the constant speculation about the possibility of a Tiananmen-style crackdown proves unfounded. The last campus to remain occupied. The Hong Kong Polytechnic University becomes the most violent battleground yet. An estimated 1,000 protesters dig in for the long haul.
即係對於我嚟講，係見到架洋武裝甲車爆個胎，其實個心真係開心。你真係會有一種佢最自豪嘅一架裝甲車竟然會爆胎咁樣。
Hardcore activists take it to a new level, mass-producing more makeshift weapons and blocking access to the nearby Cross Harbour Tunnel, a key thoroughfare connecting Hong Kong Island to the Kowloon Peninsula.
We were shocked, okay, to see so many people inside the university using this sort of violence. One of our media liaison officer got attacked by an arrow with his scarf, being struck through. It is sad to see that. Although, I must say, not all rioters inside were university students. But again, you can see a lot of university students are being exploited to use such level of violence.
邊晒都再上啊！有攬炒精神，最主要嘅目的係拉到一個巨人啊嘛。咁而巨人如果拉唔到或者傷唔到嘅，咁至少都要同佢一齊倒下先得㗎。
Police form a ring around Poly U. No one gets in, no one gets out. The campus is under siege.
放救班靚仔啦！放救佢哋啊！
They wanted to create a situation where a lot of protesters could be caught inside the university campus.
你而家出面犧牲咗咁多手足，我哋係就算我哋想後悔都唔可以後悔，一定要死頂啊！
最慘呢幾一幕亦都同時間有咁多手足喺裏邊，都顯現咗人性嘅光輝啦。 亦都睇到最大嘅人性嘅黑暗咯。
They made a big mistake because they have been successful by following the be water tactics. When they were all over the place, it's hard for the police to catch them. But on that occasion, they were corralled by the police, and they became very scared, from what I heard. So I think the police scored a decisive victory.
We shut the place down. And that's it. We're not putting up with any more of this. We locked it down, we cordoned it, we were in control of it. And I think it's a little bit of a pivotal moment, as it were.
The siege of Poly U is still underway as the city goes to the polls. Public trust in the authorities is at an all-time low, both among protesters on the streets with their unaddressed grievances and those demanding a return to law and order and peace. The anger against the government and Beijing is channeled by the protest movement into the polls, and their opposition candidates, riding on this wave of discontent, achieve a landslide victory at the municipal level district council elections. The election is widely seen as a de facto referendum on just how much public support is behind the protest movement. And the numbers make it crystal clear. Opposition candidates seize 392 out of 452 district council seats, trouncing pro-establishment candidates in a stunning rebuke to Lam's governance. But at the same time, the number of votes for pro-establishment parties add up to 1.2 million, compared with 1.6 million for the opposition. Another reflection of a divided society.
一定要救走理大嘅香港人。
After nearly 2 weeks with police surrounding the campus and protesters holed up inside, the siege of PolyU ends. Protesters abandon the campus over the course of several days. Hundreds are arrested by waiting police. When police take over the campus, they make a stunning discovery. A stockpiled arsenal of nearly 4,000 petrol bombs, almost 1,400 explosive items, more than 600 bottles of corrosive liquids, and nearly 600 other weapons. But it is no decisive victory for the authorities to celebrate. Hong Kong society has never been so traumatized, exhausted, or divided. Christmas 2019. And the protests continue. On the streets and in shopping malls. Glory to Hong Kong, a song born of the protest movement, becomes the anthem of defiance. Patriotic groups opposing the protests hold rival singing sessions, belting out China's national anthem in a musical counter-offensive. Protesters target shops they see as being run by people who oppose them. Shopping malls become another battleground as police go in after them. Like the protesters, police also change tactics, taking more aggressive, often preemptive action to restore law and order. They are led by a new commissioner, Chris Tang, who brings in a bolder, no-nonsense style of policing. The police force is no longer the demoralized and embattled agency struggling to control the protests. Encouraged also by Beijing's vocal support for officers, it hails as heroes. And then, on top of everything, comes the coronavirus pandemic. COVID-19, in a city already scarred by SARS, keeps people off the streets. The protests are not over, but they're dying down. Police enforce social distancing rules while getting tougher and more resolute in their crackdowns on protest violence and illegal gatherings. The combined impact on the scale and frequency of protests is substantial. Just a few months ago, Lam's government had invoked emergency powers to ban the use of masks, its targets being the radicals covering their faces to break the law. Now it has to ask everyone to wear masks to save lives. For the first time in 3 decades, police ban Hong Kong's annual candlelight vigil to mark the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square crackdown. But thousands remain defiant, gathering at Victoria Park in the heart of the Causeway Bay business district. Authorities cite the risk of COVID-19, but for protesters and opposition activists, the pandemic is being used as an excuse to suppress them. They have another reason to rally, and it's something far more devastating to the movement, of far more consequence to the city: the new national security law. Just days ahead of the June 4 commemoration, China's top legislative body unanimously passes the national security law for Hong Kong. The new law outlaws acts of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. Beijing had left it to the Hong Kong government to end the protest chaos of the previous year. It now decides to step in directly, citing a threat to national security and accusing foreign governments of interference that it can no longer tolerate. News that sweeping new legislation is coming sparks more calls at these protests for independence. The open calls by protesters for US and British intervention, the pleas for punitive action against China, the anti-national slogans, the attacks on the symbols of Chinese sovereignty, all have far-reaching consequences. With Hong Kong now a battleground for the wider political confrontation between China and the United States, already locked in a raging trade war, Beijing decides to act. The new legislation is sweeping and immediately targets acts such as the waving of pro-independence flags and chanting of pro-independence slogans. Vandalism like this can now be considered a terrorist act, and the penalties can be as severe as life in prison. The new law takes effect late into the night of June 30th. Thousands try to protest against it the next day, July the 1st, the 23rd anniversary of Hong Kong's return to Chinese rule. Nearly 400 people are arrested, and, for the first time, 10 are accused of breaching the new national security law. Life under the new law. Many fear the national security legislation will be used to undermine freedoms and stifle dissent. The opposition sees it as the beginning of the end of the one country, two systems policy, under which Hong Kong enjoys a high degree of autonomy. Western governments, led by the US, threaten serious consequences and follow up with punitive action and sanctions against the city and its leaders.
I am directing my administration to begin the process of eliminating policy exemptions that give Hong Kong different and special treatment.
中央今次係堅定不移去進行呢個立法工作。
But both the local and central governments dig in, insisting that the law will be used only to ensure security. They say fundamental rights will be protected by the city's judicially independent courts, and it will be back to business as usual. Amid the conflicting narratives, the city now houses a dedicated national security office with a special police unit to enforce the law. They hit the ground running and have already started taking action. Armed with new legal powers, national security police are now part of the new law enforcement landscape. People are now arrested for acts that they could get away with previously, but are now considered serious crimes. The chaos may be over for now, and the streets quieter, but Hong Kong society remains more divided than ever.
個心會爽一爽，毫無疑問地，我係覺得我應該要放下仇恨。我唔認為仇恨會令到我哋嘅社會進步，但係喺一個社會當中，我都冇辦法去完全清理到自己嘅仇恨。我冇辦法說服話俾我聽嗰班警察係只係執行公務。我冇辦法接受到，冇辦法原諒到佢做過嘅事。唯一可以令到呢一種情緒得到安息，就係警察為佢哋嘅行為負擔咗責任。
你係咪人嚟㗎？你根本唔係人嚟㗎！你個仆！
I am not a human rights abuser. There are no burnt villages, there are no mass graves. It's just police officers doing their job, acting in accordance with the law. And I appreciate a lot of the public don't like that. But that's the way it is.
How should Hong Kong move forward? How can it carry on?
實現雙普選先至係令到香港可以穩定嘅關鍵。基本法寫住就係大陸唔可以干預香港一切部門，然之後港人係治港嘅，然之後仲話俾你聽，香港係會循序漸進，最終達至普選。當香港冇真普選，立法會係繼續係會背離民意。當香港冇得選自己嘅特首，我哋嘅特首係會繼續踐踏香港人嘅權利。
I am not in despair because I know we are doing the right thing. I know we have the moral high ground because they are breaking agreements, not me. They are doing all these things they promised not to do, and we are just holding them to their contract, if you like.
Hong Kong cannot enjoy two systems without acceptance of the country. So I think Beijing, through all the statements they are putting out, they are reminding Hong Kong people, they are telling Hong Kong people emphatically, you are part of the country. If you want your future to continue as under one country, two systems, you have to respect China's sovereignty, security, and developmental interests. That's how you can continue to carry on.
The Communist Party never wants our community to heal. They want to divide and conquer. But I don't believe our civil servants and our officials want that. They are still Hong Kong people. They know our values. I know in their hearts too they must treasure the same values as we treasure. They may agree to take orders from the communists, but I don't think they enjoy doing all these things to our young people. They too have kids. I don't hate these people. I pity them.
The narratives are different, but most agree on one reality. It's not over yet.
The issues that gave rise to this, perhaps with the exception of the extradition bill itself, the issues haven't really been addressed. When they are, it's going to take a long time to solve them.
我認為香港嘅兩派系嘅撕裂會更加越嚟越大啦，武力嘅程度隨之會增多啦。 每位嘅同路人、手足抗爭者喺未來嘅抗爭運動裏邊可以做得幾多嘅嘢，就要繼續去支持自己，去支持其他人去繼續做，令到抗爭可以最大效益化。我相信未來當時機到嘅時候，我哋會喺戰場上面再見。
Political consideration is not something that we have to consider. Okay? As a police officer, we need to maintain law and order. We do expect that this will go on again, maybe after the coronavirus is being under control. But of course, we stand ready for that.
I think this is make or break time for Hong Kong. Things are coming to a head. The debate about one country, two systems, the debate about whether Beijing's officers are interfering in our internal affairs, what is the level of our autonomy. These things are coming to a head. These are the core issues.
Although scenes like these are from the past now, Hong Kong remains a troubled city, a politically torn landscape facing an uncertain future as it also struggles with the economic fallout from the pandemic. And the world is watching how China handles its rebel city.